There was a name that even wolves feared to speak aloud. Not the name of a king, not the name of a warrior born with claws longer than memory itself. It was the name of an assassin, a shadow that moved through the ancient wolf packs like sickness moves through still water. Silent, sure, leaving behind nothing but cold bodies and wide, empty eyes that had seen death coming and could not stop it. No one had ever seen him arrive. No one had lived long enough to say they had seen him leave. His name was Kael. For 3 generations he had walked through the territories of Lapara, and not one pair of eyes had caught him in time. Not the sharpest scouts, not the most vigilant guards, not the wisest advisors who had spent decades learning to read the intentions of men. Every alpha who sat upon a stone throne believed they were safe because they had warriors, because they had walls, because they had trained their fighters to be the strongest any pack had ever raised. But walls did not stop shadows, and warriors could not fight what they could not see. The old wolves whispered that Kael had not been born of any wolf mother, that he had crawled out from the dark between stars, that the moon herself had turned away the night he first drew blood. They said his eyes were pale as winter ice, and when he looked at you, he saw not a wolf, not a person, but simply a task to be completed, a body that would soon stop moving. And in 3 generations of hunting, he had never failed. Until the night a young Omega woman named Teslin, with no rank, no power, and no reason to be anywhere near the matters of kings, saw what no one else could see, read what no one else could read, and changed the shape of an entire kingdom with nothing but her eyes and the quiet, unbreakable certainty that she had always carried folded tight inside her chest. This is that story, and it begins not in a throne room or on a battlefield, but in a place far smaller and far quieter. In a village called Ashvale, where the Omega quarters sat low between 2 hills and where the smell of tanning pits drifted through narrow streets when the wind turned east, where a young woman with steady hands and watchful eyes mended torn things and kept her mouth closed because she had learned very early that no one listens to an Omega who speaks uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths turn out to be right. The hut where Teslin lived was not large. 1 room with a straw sleeping mat in the corner, a low table for her mending work, and a small clay stove that she banked each night before the sun went down. The walls were woven reed and packed clay, sturdy enough to keep out the wind, but thin enough that she could hear everything that happened in the neighboring huts. The voices, the arguments, the rhythm of daily life moving around her like water around a stone. She was 25 years old, slight in frame. With dark hair, she kept braided tight against her skull, because loose hair was one more thing to manage, and Teslin did not keep anything around her that served no purpose. Her eyes were unusual. Set wide apart, dark brown shot through with flecks of amber that caught the light in a way that made people uncomfortable if she held their gaze too long. So she had learned not to hold it. She had learned to look slightly to the side of people's faces when they spoke to her, just enough to make them feel seen without making them feel studied. But she was always studying, always watching, always reading the small tells that people gave without knowing they were giving them. The way old Merrick from 3 huts down always touched the side of his jaw when he lied about how much grain he had stored. The way young Denna's left foot turned inward just before she started crying. The way the village dogs went silent in the eastern quarter, a full breath before strangers crested the hill road. Teslin noticed everything. She had always noticed everything. And for most of her life, she had believed this noticing was a curse because noticing things that others missed only brought trouble when you were an Omega, and no one wanted to hear what you had to say. She had learned this lesson when she was 15 years old, and it had carved itself into her bones so deeply that she still felt the ache of it on cold mornings. Her mother had been healthy, strong, a beta woman who had fallen in rank when she bore an Omega daughter, but who had never treated Teslin as though this was something to be ashamed of. They had lived together in the same small hut, and her mother had taught her the mending trade. How to stitch leather so the seam would hold. How to weave broken basket reeds back together so they were stronger than before. But in the spring of Teslin's 15th year, her mother had begun to change. Small things at first, a faint yellowing at the edges of her eyes, a subtle shift in the rhythm of her breathing like her lungs were working harder than they should, the way her fingers trembled when she held a needle though she tried to hide it. Teslin had noticed. Of course she had noticed. She had gone to the village healer, a gray-haired Omega woman named Karis, who had been tending the sick for 40 years. She had described what she had seen, the yellow in the eyes, the breathing pattern, the tremor. Karis had listened with the patience of someone who had heard 1,000 worried daughters describe 1,000 minor ailments. She had patted Teslin's hand and told her that mothers got tired as they aged and there was nothing to worry about. Teslin had gone to the pack elder next, a beta man named Torben, who sat in judgment on disputes and kept the records. She had told him that something was wrong with her mother, that these symptoms meant something, that she had read about them in the old healer text her grandmother had left behind. Torvin had looked at her the way adults look at children who speak out of turn. He had told her that Omega girls should not waste the time of their elders with anxious imaginings, that her mother was fine, that she should go home and tend to her mending work and leave the matter of health to those who understood such things. 3 days later, her mother had collapsed while carrying water from the well. By the time they brought her back to the hut, her lips had gone blue and her breathing had turned shallow and strange. The healer came. The elder came. They stood over her mother's body and spoke in low, serious voices about sudden illness and the unpredictable nature of fate. Teslin had knelt beside her mother and held her hand and watched the light fade from eyes that had once been warm and sharp and full of laughter. And she had known with a certainty that burned like hot iron in her chest that her mother had been poisoned. Slowly, carefully, by someone who had access to the well water and who had wanted her dead. She had said this to the healer, to the elder, to anyone who would listen. No one had believed her because she was 15, because she was Omega, because the idea that someone in Ashvale would poison a harmless beta woman made no sense to people who did not see what Teslin saw, who did not notice the way Torvin's hands had shaken when she mentioned poison, the way his eyes had flickered to the well and then away, the way he had married a new woman, a beta from another pack, less than 2 months after Teslin's mother was buried. She had been right. She had always known she was right. But being right had not saved her mother. Being right had not made anyone listen. Being right had only taught her that speaking uncomfortable truths when you had no rank and no power was a fast way to make yourself a target. So she had stopped speaking them. She had folded her noticing away inside herself and kept it quiet and safe. She had taken over her mother's mending work and lived alone in the small hut and learned to look to the side of people's faces and keep her mouth shut. And that was how she had lived for 10 years, mending torn things, watching everything, saying nothing, until the day the summons came from Iron Peak. It did not come to her directly. Things rarely came to Omegas directly in the territories of Lipara. The summons arrived first at the house of the pack elder, who was no longer Torvin, but a younger beta named Gareth. Gareth passed it to the village overseer. The overseer passed it to the messenger boy. And finally, on the 4th day after the sealed letter had first arrived in Ashvale, it reached Teslin in the form of a skinny Omega boy named Finn, who looked deeply uninterested in the task he had been given. He found her in the market square where she had set up her mending station. A small wooden table with a stack of torn leather straps and a basket of woven grass that needed repairing. "You're wanted at Iron Peak," Finn said, not quite looking at her. He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "The king's summons. Don't know why they'd want someone from the Omega quarters, but that's what it says." He thrust a folded piece of parchment at her and left before she could ask any questions. Teslin sat very still for a long moment, the parchment heavy in her hands. Around her, the market continued its usual rhythm, voices bargaining over dried fish and root vegetables, children running between the stalls, the smell of smoke from the food carts mixing with the ever-present scent of the tanning pits. She unfolded the parchment slowly. The message was brief, written in the formal script used by the scribes at Iron Peak. It said that her presence was requested by King Valdrin himself, that she was to present herself at the Great Hall within 7 days, that provisions for travel would be made available to her at the gate. It did not say why. Teslin read it 3 times, looking for something hidden in the words. Some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing except the bare facts of the summons and the heavy wax seal at the bottom, pressed with the mark of the king's house. A wolf's head and profile jaws opened, surrounded by a circle of stars. Iron Peak was not just any holding. It was the seat of the Alpha King, the fortress at the heart of Lipara's territories where the 12 pack lords gathered to pledge their loyalty and settle their disputes, where the strongest warriors trained, where the walls were said to be built from stone, so old that it remembered the first wolves who had walked these lands. And Valdrin was not just any king. He was the kind of name that made veteran warriors shift their weight and check their weapons when it was spoken aloud. He was fierce in the way that old storms were fierce, not loud at the start, not rushing, just building and building until you realized too late that the sky above you had gone entirely wrong. He had ruled Lipara for 11 years. In those 11 years, 3 assassination attempts had been made against him. All 3 had ended with the assassins in pieces, and the pieces sent back to whoever had hired them, wrapped in their own colors. He was not a king who needed to ask for mercy, and he was not a king who gave it without cost. Teslin had no idea why his summons had found its way to the Omega quarters of a mid-standing pack on the edge of his territory. No idea why her name had been written on parchment that bore his seal. No idea what a king who commanded the loyalty of 12 packs and 300 warriors could possibly want with a woman who mended torn leather for copper coins in a village market. But she folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her worn tunic. She packed up her mending tools and her unsold work. She walked back to her small hut and stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the space that had been her entire world for 25 years. The straw mat, the clay stove, the table where her mother had taught her to stitch leather with hands that were already showing the first signs of poison. She thought about staying, about ignoring the summons, about living out her days in Asheville the way she had always planned to, small and quiet and unnoticed. But there was something in her chest that had been asleep for 10 years, and the summons had woken it. That old sharp thing that her mother had loved and Torvin had feared. The thing that noticed everything and wanted desperately to be heard. Just once. Teslin packed a small travel sack with her second-best tunic, a skin of water, and a pouch of dried meal. She banked her fire. She locked her door. And she set out on the road toward Iron Peak before the sun reached the top of the sky. The road was 3 days long, and she walked it mostly alone. On the first day, she passed through country she had never seen before. Rolling hills covered in tall grass that bent in waves when the wind came through. Scattered stands of ancient trees with trunks so wide that 3 men could not have wrapped their arms around them. The road itself was packed earth worn smooth by generations of travelers, and it wound through the landscape like a river, finding its path. She saw other wolves on the road, merchants with carts loaded with goods, farmers driving herds of sheep toward the markets, warriors traveling in pairs wearing the colors of packs she did not recognize. No one spoke to her. She did not expect them to. An Omega woman traveling alone was barely worth noticing, and Teslin had long ago perfected the art of being unremarkable. But she watched them. She always watched. She noticed the way one merchant kept touching the side of his cart, as though checking that something was still secured beneath the canvas covering. She noticed the way a pair of warriors walked with their hands too close to their weapons, their eyes scanning the tree line in that particular way that said they were expecting trouble. She noticed the fresh burn mark on a farmer's wrist and the way he kept his burned hand tucked against his side when he thought no one was looking. Small things, meaningless things to anyone else. But Teslin collected them the way other people collected coins or stories, filing them away in the organized corners of her mind, where she kept everything she noticed and never spoke about. On the evening of the first day, she reached a small village at the crossroads where 2 trade routes met. The village had been burned, not recently. The ash was old and settled. The blackened timbers of the houses had already begun to rot. But the destruction was complete. Every building reduced to skeletal frames, every wall collapsed. Even the well at the center of the village square had been filled with debris and marked with a crude warning sign that said the water was foul. Teslin stood at the edge of the ruined village and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had heard stories about villages like this, about the work that Kyle the assassin sometimes did when he was hired not just to kill a single target, but to send a message, to make an example, to leave something behind that would be remembered. There were no bodies, the dead had been cleared away long ago, but she could still feel the violence that had happened here, the way you could feel the heat from a fire even after the flames had gone out. It lingered in the air, in the unnatural silence where birds should have been singing, but were not. She found a scrap of cloth snagged on a broken timber, dark blue torn from something larger. The edges were frayed and stained with old blood, but the weave was fine, expensive. The kind of cloth that a merchant or a minor lord might have worn. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, though she did not know why. It was just a scrap of nothing, a piece of something destroyed. But her fingers told her it was important the way her eyes told her when a stitch was about to fail or a basket weave was too loose. She did not sleep in the burned village. She walked another hour until the ruins were well behind her, and then she made camp in a hollow beside a stream where the water ran clear and the ground was soft with moss. She ate a handful of dried meal and drank from the stream and lay on her back looking up at the stars. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows. She thought about her mother, who used to tell her that the moon watched over travelers, that as long as you could see her light, you were never truly alone. Teslin did not believe in such things anymore, but she looked at the moon anyway, and in the silver light, she thought about the burned village and the scrap of blue cloth and the summons that had pulled her out of her small, quiet life and set her on a road towards something she did not yet understand. On the second day, the road climbed higher into the hills. The grass gave way to rock and hardy scrub brush. The air grew cooler, and in the distance, she could see the dark line of mountains rising against the sky. She passed a group of refugees moving in the opposite direction. A family of Omegas, maybe 20 of them traveling with everything they owned, piled into two small carts. They looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, the kind of tired that came not from walking too far, but from carrying grief that had no place to be set down. An older woman at the front of the group met Teslin's eyes as they passed, just for a moment. And in that moment, Teslin saw a story she recognized. The story of someone who had tried to warn others about danger, who had seen the signs and spoken the truth, and who had been dismissed and ignored until it was too late. The woman looked away first. Her shoulders hunched beneath the weight of a blanket roll, and she kept walking. Teslin wanted to stop her, to ask what had happened, to say that she understood that she had lived that same story, that being right when no one would listen was its own kind of death. But she did not stop. She kept walking. Because there were some things that could not be fixed by acknowledgement. Some wounds that stayed open no matter how many times you pressed your hand against them. On the evening of the second day, she crested a rise in the road and saw Iron Peak for the first time. It sat on a massive plateau of dark stone rising from the landscape like a fist rising from an arm. Sudden, undeniable, impossible to miss. The fortress walls were built from the same dark stone as the plateau itself, as though the whole structure had been carved from a single piece of ancient rock. Towers rose at each corner, topped with iron braziers that burned even in daylight, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Around the base of the plateau, a town had grown. Smaller buildings clustered together like children gathering around a parent. Markets and inns and stables. The roads that led to Iron Peak came from all directions, converging on the massive iron gate that was the only way up to the fortress proper. Even from a distance, Teslin could feel the weight of the place. The power, the certainty. This was where decisions were made that shaped the lives of every wolf in Lipara, where wars were planned and ended, where justice was dispensed and blood debts were settled. And somewhere inside those dark walls, a king she had never met was waiting for her, for reasons she still did not understand. She made camp that night in a copse of trees at the edge of the plateau town. She could hear the noise of the markets even from a distance, voices and laughter, and the clang of metal on metal from the smithies that worked late into the night. The air smelled of smoke and roasted meat and something else, something sharp and metallic that she could not quite place. She lay awake for a long time listening to the unfamiliar sounds, thinking about what she would say when she finally stood before Valdrin, how she would explain herself, what he could possibly want from an Omega Mender who had spent her entire life being invisible. The moon was high and bright overhead, and in its light she thought about the burned village and the refugees and the scrap of blue cloth folded in her pocket. She thought about her mother who had died because no one would listen to an Omega girl who saw the truth. And she made a promise to that memory, that if Valdrin asked her what she saw, she would tell him. Even if it cost her, even if no one believed her, even if speaking the truth was the most dangerous thing she could do, because being silent had not saved anyone. And she was tired of being silent. On the third morning, Teslin crossed the plateau town and approached the iron gate of Iron Peak. The gate was massive, 30 feet high, and reinforced with bands of black iron that had been worked into intricate patterns. Wolf heads and stars and symbols she did not recognize. The doors stood open and a steady stream of people moved through them. Merchants and messengers and petitioners. Warriors in the colors of a dozen different packs. 2 guards stood at the entrance. Beta males broad-shouldered and armed with spears that had seen use. They watched the flow of traffic with the bored efficiency of men who had been doing this job for years. Teslin approached them and stood quietly to the side until one of them glanced at her. "State your business," he said. His voice was flat, uninterested. "I was summoned," Teslin said. She kept her eyes on the stone at his feet. "By King Valdrin." The guard's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air. He looked at her more carefully. An Omega woman in worn travel clothes. No weapons, no colors, nothing that marked her as important. "Name," he said. "Teslin of Ashvale." The second guard pulled a rolled parchment from a leather case at his belt. He scanned the list of names written there. His eyebrows rose slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Wait here," the first guard said. He disappeared through the gate. Teslin stood where she was, her hands folded in front of her, while the second guard watched her with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle they had not expected to encounter. Around them, the flow of people continued. Merchants arguing over tariffs, warriors laughing too loudly. The normal chaos of a fortress gate. The first guard returned after several long minutes. His face had changed, not much, just a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. "You're to be escorted to the inner hall," he said. His voice was careful, the way voices got when people were trying not to show confusion. "Follow me." Teslin followed him through the gate and into Iron Peak. The outer yard was vast. easily large enough to hold 500 people with room to spare. The ground was paved with flat stones worn smooth by countless feet. Buildings lined the walls on all sides, barracks and storerooms and workshops. The air was thick with the smell of horses and leather and the metallic tang of the forges that never stopped burning. Warriors stood in groups talking in low voices. Some were training with practiced weapons in a roped-off section of the yard. Others were mending gear or checking armor, or simply standing watch with the stillness of men who knew how to wait. Every single one of them turned to look at Teslin as she passed. Not openly, not rudely, but she felt their eyes, felt the question in their gazes. Omega woman. Worn clothes. No escort? No obvious reason to be here. She kept her own eyes down and her steps steady and her breathing controlled, and she followed the guard through a second gate into the heart of the fortress. The inner yard was smaller, quieter. The buildings here were built from darker stone and the windows were narrow and high. This was where the serious work of Iron Peak happened, where the council met and the king held court and decisions were made that shaped territories. The guard led her to the entrance of the Great Hall, a set of double doors carved from ancient wood and reinforced with iron bands. He knocked twice. The doors swung open. The Great Hall of Iron Peak was not like anything Teslin had ever seen. The ceiling was high, so high that the shadows at the top were lost in darkness despite the fire pits that burned in long channels down the center of the room. The walls were hung with pelts, wolf pelts, dozens of them. The hides of wolves who had challenged Valdrin and lost. Not a cruelty exactly, more of a language, a statement that every wolf who walked into this hall could read before they ever opened their mouths. The floor was polished stone, dark and smooth. The fire pits cast dancing light across its surface, and the heat from the flames made the air shimmer. At the far end of the hall on a raised platform of carved stone sat Valdrin. He was large in the way that mountains were large. Not loud about it, not making a show, just occupying a space in a way that made the space feel smaller. His hair was dark and unbound, falling past his shoulders. His jaw was set hard. His eyes were amber, and they were already on Teslin as she walked the length of the hall toward him. She could feel the weight of his attention, the pressure of it. This was an alpha in his prime, a king who had held power for 11 years and who knew exactly how much strength it took to keep holding it. Around him, arranged in a semicircle, stood his council. 7 wolves, all of them older, all of them dressed in the fine clothes and formal colors of their positions. They watched Teslin with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Teslin stopped at what she judged to be a respectful distance from the platform. She lowered her head, not too low, not submissive, but enough to acknowledge rank. The hall was very quiet. Valdrin looked at her for a long moment. His face gave nothing, absolutely nothing. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than she had expected from a man his size. "You are Teslin of Ashvale." It was not a question. "I am your majesty." "You mend things." "I do." He was quiet again, studying her, reading her the way she had spent her whole life reading other people. She kept her eyes on the stone floor and let him look. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked. "No, your majesty." Valdrin leaned forward slightly in his seat. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face and made the shadows deeper. 7 days ago, he said, my chief advisor died in his sleep, a man named Oren. He was 50 years old, healthy, strong, no history of illness. He went to bed after an ordinary day and did not wake up. Teslin said nothing. She felt the cold beginning in her chest, the same cold she had felt when she first noticed the yellow in her mother's eyes. The healers examined him, Valdrin continued. They found nothing, no wounds, no obvious cause. They said it was his heart, that sometimes hearts simply stop. He paused, but I did not believe them. The council members shifted slightly, uncomfortable. This was clearly a conversation that had been had before. I had Oren's chamber searched, Valdrin said, his belongings examined, his food tested, his servants questioned, and still nothing, no evidence of foul play, no trace of poison or violence, just a dead man who should not have been dead. His amber eyes had not left Teslin's face. I was told, he said slowly, that there was an Omega woman in a village on the edge of my territories who sees things that others miss, who has never once been wrong about what she sees, who reads people and places and patterns the way hunters read tracks in snow. Teslin's heart was beating very fast. She did not know who had told him this, did not know how her name had traveled from Ashvale to Iron Peak, but she understood now why she was here. In 7 days, Valdrin said, there will be a great feast in this hall. The 12 pack lords who swear loyalty to me will gather here with their retinues. 300 wolves. the most important gathering of the year. He leaned back in his seat. Someone is going to try to kill me during that feast. I believe they will try it here inside these walls, surrounded by my guards and my allies. And I believe whoever killed Oren is testing their method, perfecting it, getting ready. The hall was absolutely still. Even the flames in the fire pits seemed to burn more quietly. Valdrin's voice dropped lower, harder. My guards are the finest I have ever trained. My advisors are sharp. My walls are thick. In 11 years, no one has put a blade within reach of me inside these walls. And yet I am not easy, because someone got to Oren. Someone killed a man I trusted in his own bed and left no trace. He looked at Teslin with those fierce amber eyes, and she felt the full weight of what he was asking before he even said the words. I want you in this hall for the next 7 days. I want your eyes open. I want you to look at my guards and my servants and my council and my guests, and I want you to tell me what you see. Teslin finally looked up, finally met his gaze directly. Just for a moment, just long enough to read the thing in his face that she had been reading slowly from the edges since she walked in. It was not fear. Valdrin was not a man who feared in ordinary ways. It was certainty. The cold, clear certainty of a man who knew that something was already in motion and could not yet see where it would land. She looked back down at the stone floor and spoke clearly. I will need to move freely, through the hall, the yards, the kitchens, the servant quarters. I will need to go where I need to go without explanation. One of the council members made a small sound. Disbelief or outrage, it was hard to tell. Valdrin's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders settled, just barely. It will be arranged, he said. And that was how Teslin of Ashvale Omega Mender, of Torn Things woman, that no one counted, came to stand inside the walls of Iron Peak 7 days before someone tried to end the life of the most feared Alpha King in all of Lepara. She did not know yet that the assassin was already inside the walls, that he had been inside for more than 2 weeks, that he had killed Oren as a test, as practice, as a way of measuring the defenses he would need to overcome. She did not know yet that his name was Kael, and that he was the Shadow Wolves had whispered about in fear for 3 generations. She did not know yet that the thing inside her, the thing she had kept quiet and folded away for 10 years, was not just a habit of noticing, not just a skill, but something older and deeper, a gift that had been passed down through her bloodline from a grandmother she had never met, a gift that had been sleeping, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. But she would know all of it before the feast fires burned down to ash. They gave her a small room near the grain stores, and she set her travel sack on the narrow cot and stood at the single window looking out at the inner yard of Iron Peak, watching the patterns of movement, the rhythms of a fortress preparing for the most important gathering of the year. And in the depths of those patterns, invisible to everyone else, a shadow named Kael moved through his careful preparations. Patient, thorough, certain that he would do what he had come to do. He had been certain of that in every hall he had ever entered, but he had never been in a hall that contained Teslin of Ashvale, and he did not know she existed, and that more than anything else was the only advantage she needed. The moon rose over Iron Peak, the fires burned in their braziers, and the 7 days began to count down toward the feast that would change everything. The first thing Teslin did after settling into her small room near the grain stores was nothing at all. She sat on the narrow cot with her hands folded in her lap and let the fortress breathe around her. Let the sounds find their natural rhythm. Footsteps in the corridor outside, voices calling across the yard, the distant clang of metal on metal from the forges, the creak of cart wheels on stone, the low murmur of conversation drifting up from the kitchens below. She closed her eyes and listened, not for anything specific, just for the pattern, the baseline, the normal sound of Iron Peak going about its daily business. Because before you could see what was wrong, you had to know what right it looked like. Her mother had taught her that. A long time ago, when Teslin was still small enough to sit on the mending table and watch her mother's hands move through the intricate work of repairing a torn fishing net. You have to know how the whole net is supposed to look, her mother had said, before you can find the one strand that is out of place. Teslin sat in the small room and let Iron Peak become a net in her mind, vast and complex and woven together from 1,000 different threads. And somewhere in that net, there was a strand that did not belong, a knot tied wrong, a gap where there should have been strength. She just had to find it. When the sun had moved a hand's width across the narrow window, she rose. She smoothed her worn tunic. She checked that her braid was still tight against her skull. And she walked out into the fortress with the water jug she had borrowed from the kitchen stores, because a servant carrying water had a reason to be anywhere, and no one questioned servants who looked like they knew where they were going. The inner yard was busy with preparations for the great feast. 7 days, that was how long she had. 7 days to find an assassin who had been invisible for 3 generations. 7 days to see what Valdrin's guards and advisors and healers had all missed. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the yard, filling her water jug at the well, pausing to adjust the leather strap on her shoulder, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who had been given a task and was simply completing it. No one looked at her twice. Omega servant with a water jug, as unremarkable as air, but she was looking at everything. The yard was roughly square, bounded on all sides by the dark stone buildings that formed the heart of Iron Peak. The Great Hall dominated the western side, its entrance marked by those massive carved doors. To the north were the council chambers and the royal apartments. To the east, the kitchens and servant quarters. And to the south, the storerooms, grain and weapons and firewood, and all the supplies needed to keep a fortress running. Guards stood at regular intervals. She counted them, marked their positions, noticed the way they changed shifts. 2 hours on, 2 hours off, rotating through 3 different teams. The pattern was tight, professional, exactly what you would expect from a king who had survived 3 assassination attempts. Servants moved through the space in their own patterns, kitchen workers carrying trays of bread from the ovens, stable hands leading horses to and from the southern gate, craftsmen hauling timber for the feast tables that were being constructed in the Great Hall. Everything looked normal, everything looked right, but Teslin had learned long ago that normal was where danger hid best. She watched the flow of movement for the better part of an hour, and slowly the way a picture in still water becomes clear, once you stop disturbing the surface, she began to see the deeper patterns, the invisible lines that people walked without knowing they were walking them, the gaps in the guard rotations, the moments when the yard went briefly thin and unobserved. There, a blind spot near the eastern corner where the kitchen entrance met the edge of the grain stores. For perhaps 30 seconds during each guard rotation, that corner was unwatched. Not obviously, not dangerously. But if you knew the timing, if you had counted the pattern, you could slip through that space without being seen. She filed it away, moved on. The wood store caught her attention next. It was built against the southern wall, a long, low structure with an open front where bundles of cut timber were stacked in neat rows. The wood for the feast fires, cedar and oak and pine enough to keep the Great Hall warm through 3 days of celebration. A servant was there now, loading a bundle onto his shoulder. A man of middle height and middle build, wearing the rough brown tunic of the labor crews. He moved with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this task many times before, lifted the bundle, turned, walked toward the side entrance of the Great Hall. Teslin watched him go. Something in her chest went very still. The wood was wrong, not obviously wrong, not in a way that anyone would notice unless they were looking. But the bundle on his shoulder was cut from different timber than the stacks around it. The grain was finer, the color slightly darker, and it had not been cut the way working wood was cut, rough and fast and practical. It had been cut neatly, almost carefully, as though the shape of it mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with burning. She set her water jug down. She waited until the man had disappeared through the side entrance, and then she walked to the wood store and stood looking at the stacks of timber. Most of it was old stock, rough bark still clinging to some of the pieces. The natural variation you would expect from wood that had been cut and stored over time. But in the back corner, partially hidden behind the older bundles, there were 3 logs that did not match. Smoother, darker, too carefully shaped. Teslin glanced around the yard. No one was watching. The guards were focused outward on the gates and the approaches. The servants were busy with their tasks. She moved quickly to the back of the wood store and crouched beside the mismatched logs. Up close, the difference was even more obvious. These had been worked by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who understood wood and tools and the art of making something look like it belonged when it absolutely did not. She pressed her fingers against the surface of the nearest log, felt the hollow space and saw it before she even looked, because her fingers knew the difference between solid timber and something that had been carved out and carefully sealed again. There, a seam so fine that you would miss it if you were not searching for it, hidden along the natural grain of the wood, sealed with pine resin that had been colored to match the surrounding bark. Her heart was beating fast now, steady but fast, the way it had beaten when she first saw the yellow in her mother's eyes and knew with terrible certainty that something was very wrong. She did not open the log, not here, not now, but she knew what was inside, could smell it even through the resin in the wood, faint and sweet in a way that had no business being sweet. Ember root. It was a plant that grew in the deep forests of the Northern Territories. Rare, expensive, and when it was dried and ground into paste, it produced a smoke that had no color and no strong smell and would stop a wolf's heart as quietly and completely as pressing a hand over a candle flame. Someone had hollowed out this log. Someone had placed a sealed vessel of ember root paste inside it, and someone had positioned it so that when the feast fires burned low and the servants came to feed them with fresh wood, this log would be pulled from the stack and thrown into the flames, and the heat would crack the vessel, and the paste would burn, and the smoke would rise invisible into the warm air of the great hall, where 300 wolves would be gathered, eating and drinking and feeling safe. Teslin sat back on her heels. Her hands were steady, but the cold in her chest had spread to her arms and legs. This was not the work of an amateur. This was careful, precise. The work of someone who understood timing and chemistry and the art of making death look like accident. This was the work of Kael. She left the log exactly where she had found it, did not disturb it, did not move it, because moving it would tell the assassin that someone had discovered his work, and a discovered plan was a plan that would change. And a plan that changed was a plan she could not track. She rose, she picked up her water jug, and she walked back into the yard with the same unhurried purpose she had carried before, though now the world felt different, sharper, more dangerous. Kael was here, inside these walls, moving through the fortress like smoke through a room, and he had been here long enough to place this trap with care. On the second day, Teslin found two more pieces of his plan. The first was in the great hall itself. She had volunteered to help the servants who were setting up the long tables for the feast, because helping meant she could move through the space freely, could touch the walls, and the torch brackets, and the stone benches, without anyone questioning why an Omega woman was running her hands over surfaces that had nothing to do with water jugs or mending work. The great hall in daylight was different than it had been when she first arrived. The fire pits were cold. The shadows were pushed back into the high corners where the ceiling met the walls. Workers moved through the space measuring and hammering and arguing good-naturedly about the best way to arrange the seating for 12 pack lords who all believed they deserved places of honor. Teslin worked alongside them. She carried planks. She held one end of a measuring rope. She fetched tools from the storage room. And while she worked, she watched. The torch brackets were mounted along the walls at regular intervals, heavy iron fixtures that held the great torches that would light the feast. They had been there for generations, built into the stone itself, solid and permanent. She checked each one, ran her fingers along the base where the bracket met the wall, felt for anything that did not belong. The sixth bracket, the one nearest to where the king's table would be positioned, felt wrong, not loose, not damaged. But there was something tucked behind it, a strip of cloth thin and dark pressed into the narrow gap between the iron and the stone. She could barely see it, could only feel it with her fingertips when she reached up and searched the space that most people would never think to search. She worked it free slowly, carefully, while pretending to check the stability of the bracket itself. A servant checking that the fixtures would hold the weight of the torches. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. The cloth came free in her hand. She palmed it quickly and moved away from the wall back to the pile of planks she had been carrying. In the better light near the cold fire pit, she examined what she had found. It was a strip of linen perhaps 6 inches long and 2 inches wide, dark brown, rough woven, the kind of cloth that would burn slowly, and it had been soaked in something. Oil, her nose told her, but not cooking oil, something sharper, more volatile, the kind of oil that would catch flame easily and burn hot. Ember root oil, different from the paste in the hollow log, but serving the same purpose. This strip would be dried out by the heat of the torch above it, and when the feast was in full swing, when the hall was warm and crowded, and the torches were burning bright, the oil would begin to release into the air. Slow, invisible, drifting down over the king's table like a breath you could not see. One more layer, one more way to ensure the poison reached its target. Teslin wrapped the cloth back up carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her tunic. She would need to show Valdrin to prove what she had found, but not yet, not until she had seen the whole picture. Because if there were 2 pieces to this plan, there were almost certainly more. She found the third piece that afternoon in the narrow passage that connected the kitchens to the great hall. It was a servant's rote too small for the main traffic of the feast, but essential for the kitchen staff who would be carrying food and drink back and forth throughout the evening. The walls were plain stone, the floor was worn smooth by generations of hurrying feet, and halfway down the passage there was a place where 2 stones did not quite meet. A gap, small, easy to miss if you were not looking. Teslin knelt beside it, ran her fingers along the edge of the gap, felt the hollow space behind the stones. Something had been placed there. A small vessel, clay by the feel of it, sealed with wax. She did not pull it out, but she knew what it was, another cache of poison. positioned so that anyone brushing past in the narrow passage might crack the wax seal without realizing it, might release what was inside into the close air of the corridor. 3 layers, 3 different methods of delivery, all designed to work together, to ensure that even if one failed, the others would succeed. This was not just careful planning. This was mastery. The work of someone who had done this so many times that they could anticipate every possible failure and plan around it. Teslin sat back on her heels in the dim passage and felt the weight of what she was facing. Kale was not just good, he was perfect, and he had been perfecting his craft for 3 generations. Longer than she had been alive. Longer than anyone in this fortress had been watching for him. How did you catch a shadow that had never been caught? How did you see a man who had made invisibility into an art? The answer came to her slowly the way truth always came to her, not in a flash, not in a sudden revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of details that finally added up to something clear. You caught him by being more invisible than he was, by watching from a place he did not expect to be watched from, by being the one thing he had never encountered before, an Omega who saw everything. That evening, Teslin requested a private audience with Valdrin. The guard who received her request looked at her with the same confused expression she was beginning to recognize. Omega woman, asking to speak privately with the king. It was not something that happened in Iron Peak. It was not something that happened anywhere. But she had been summoned by Valdrin himself, and whatever his reasons for bringing her here, they were serious enough that the guards had been told to accommodate her. She was taken to a smaller chamber off the main council room, a space with a single table and 2 chairs, and a narrow window that looked out over the eastern hills. Valdrin was already there when she arrived, standing by the window with a cup of dark wine in his hand. He looked tired, not weak, not diminished, but tired in the way that leaders get tired when they are carrying weight that cannot be shared. He turned when she entered, gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit," he said. Teslin sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Valdrin did not sit. He stayed by the window looking out at the fading light. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Tell me what you have found." So she told him. About the hollow log in the wood store with its vessel of ember root paste. About the oil-soaked cloth behind the torch bracket. About the sealed vessel in the kitchen passage. She described the placement, the timing, the way each piece was designed to work with the others. When she finished, Valdrin was very still. He set his wine cup down on the table with slow, deliberate care. "You are certain," he said, "completely." He turned to face her fully. His amber eyes were hard. "If what you say is true, then the assassin is already inside my walls. Has been inside for days, perhaps weeks." "Yes. And you believe this is the work of Kael?" "I do." Valdrin's jaw tightened. She could see him processing this, adjusting his understanding of the threat, of how close it had already come. "We will remove the poison," he said. "Search every room, every passage. Lock down the fortress until we find him." "No." The word hung in the air between them. Valdrin's eyes narrowed. "No." His voice was very soft, very dangerous. Teslin kept her hands folded, kept her breathing even. This was the moment, the choice that would determine whether Valdrin truly trusted her or whether she was just an interesting curiosity he had brought to Iron Peak on a whim. "If you change anything," she said, "he will know. He has been watching this fortress the same way I have been watching it, reading the patterns, looking for the things that do not fit. If guards suddenly start searching rooms they have never searched before, if poison is removed from places and no one should have found it, he will know his plan has been discovered. And then he will disappear. Or change his approach, and the next plan he makes will be one I have not found, one I cannot track." Valdrin looked at her for a long moment. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of risks, the terrible choice between action and inaction. "You want me to do nothing," he said, "to leave the poison in place, to let the feast proceed exactly as planned." "Yes. And trust that you will stop him when the moment comes." "Yes." The chamber was very quiet. Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, and the light coming through the window had turned the color of old gold. Valdrin picked up his wine cup, drank, set it down again. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. Not unkindly, just honestly. "You are an Omega from a small village. You have no training, no experience with matters like this. You are asking me to bet my life and the lives of my pack lords and the stability of my entire kingdom on your ability to outthink an assassin who has never failed." Teslin looked up at him, met his eyes directly. "Because I have already seen him," she said, "and he does not know it." Valdrin went very still. "You have seen Kael." "Not as Kael, as a wood carrier, a servant, Someone so ordinary that your guards look straight past him without seeing. But I saw him. I saw the way his eyes move, the way he reads a room, the way he positions himself. I know what he looks like now, and I will know where he is during the feast." She paused, chose her next words carefully. "Your guards are trained to fight enemies they can see, but they cannot see him. I can. That is why you brought me here. Not because I am strong or skilled or ranked, but because I see what others miss. And right now, that is the only weapon you have that Kael does not know how to defend against." Valdrin looked at her for a long time, and then something changed in his face, something she had not seen before. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You are not what I expected," and he said quietly. "Neither are you, your majesty." He almost laughed, almost. Then the seriousness returned. "If I agree to this," he said, "if I let the plan run, what do you need from me? Time, freedom to continue searching, and your trust that when the moment comes I will not fail." Valdrin nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised her. He pulled out the second chair and sat down across from her, not as a king addressing a subject, but as one person talking to another. "I was told about you by someone I trust," he said. "An old healer named Grenna. She said you had a gift, that you saw your mother's death coming and no one would listen. She said you have been quiet for years, but that if anyone could find an invisible enemy, it would be you." Teslin felt something catch in her chest. Grenna. She had not heard that name in years. The old Omega healer who had left Ashvale when Teslin was still young, who had been one of the few people to ever look at her and see something other than rank. "Grenna is here," she asked. "She will be. She is traveling with the Pack Lords from the Western Territories. She serves as healer for Lord Aldrich's retinue. She should arrive in 3 days." 3 days. Teslin felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Grenna would understand, would believe her, would be an ally in a fortress where she had none. But 3 days was also 3 days closer to the feast, 3 days less to find the rest of Kael's plan. "I will not fail you," she said to Valdrin. He looked at her with those amber eyes that saw too much. "See that you do not," he said, "because if Kael succeeds, we both die, and Lupara tears itself apart in the chaos that follows." Over the next 2 days, Teslin found 3 more pieces of Kael's web. A second hollow log in the wood store positioned to be reached and after the first. Insurance in case the first vessel did not crack properly. A bone carving tucked into a gap in the stone wall behind where the king's seat would be placed. It was small, ancient, marked with symbols that Teslin recognized from the old text her grandfather had shown her years ago. The symbols were a message, a signal, the language that assassins used to communicate with the people who hired them. This one said, "Ready, waiting, proceed as planned," which meant Kael had a contact inside Iron Peak. Someone on the council or close to it. Someone who would receive this signal and know that everything was in place. The thought made Teslin's skin cold. It was one thing to hunt an assassin. It was another thing entirely to know that someone in Valdrin's inner circle had betrayed him, had invited death into these walls, and was waiting for it to arrive. She began watching the council members. There were 7 of them, 5 men, 2 women, all of them older, all of them with decades of service to Valdrin or to the kings who had come before him. She watched the way they moved through the fortress, the way they spoke to each other, the small tells that people gave when they were lying or hiding something. And on the evening of the 4th day, she saw it. Counselor Morvain, an older man with gray hair and a careful smile. He was walking through the inner yard and his path took him past the section of wall where the bone carving was hidden. He did not stop, did not obviously look at it, but his hand brushed the wall as he passed, just lightly, just for a moment. It could have been nothing, an accidental touch, the natural movement of a man walking close to a wall. But Teslin had learned long ago that nothing was ever truly accidental. And when Morvain's hand touched that section of wall, his eyes had flickered, just for the briefest instant, a micro-expression that said he was checking something, confirming something, receiving a message. Teslin felt the cold settle deeper into her chest. Morvain was one of Valdrin's oldest advisors, had served him for 9 years, had been present for every major decision, every battle plan, every negotiation, and he had betrayed all of it. She needed to be sure, needed to test this before she went to Valdrin with an accusation that could not be taken back. So she set a trap. The next morning, she made sure to cross paths with Morvain in the council chamber. She was carrying water as always, playing her part as the invisible Omega servant. And as she passed near him, she stumbled. Not badly. Just enough to splash a small amount of water on the stone floor near his feet. "Forgive me, counselor," she said, keeping her eyes down. How clumsy. He waved it away with the distracted kindness of someone who barely registered her existence. And then as she knelt to wipe up the water with a cloth, she spoke again, quietly, as though talking to herself. They are adding extra guards to the north entrance tomorrow night. Something about a concern with the supply caravans. It was a lie. There were no extra guards being added anywhere. But she said it just loudly enough that Morvain would hear if he was listening. He did not react, did not turn, did not acknowledge that he had heard anything at all. But the next day, Teslin saw the man she knew as Kyle adjusting his position in the yard, moving slightly south, away from the north entrance. The lie she had planted had traveled, from her lips to Morvain's ears, from Morvain to Kyle. And Kale had adjusted his plan based on false information, which proved two things. First, that Morvain was the traitor, and second, that Kyle was listening to Morvain's signals, which meant Kale believed his plan was still secret, still safe, which meant Teslin had the advantage she needed. On the fourth evening, 3 days before the feast, Grenna arrived. Teslin saw her in the yard as the sun was setting, an older Omega woman with gray hair braided in the traditional style. She moved slowly with the careful dignity of someone whose body had begun to betray them, but whose mind was still sharp as winter wind. She was traveling with Lord Aldrich's retinue, as Valdrin had said, 24 wolves in the colors of the Western Territories, warriors in attendance and servants. But Grenna stood apart from them, not in rank, just in bearing, in the quiet authority that came from having spent 60 years watching and learning and surviving. Teslin felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not realized was tight. Grenna was here. Grenna, who had looked at a 15-year-old Omega girl and seen not just grief but rightness, who had believed Teslin when no one else would, who had left Ashvale years ago but who had apparently never forgotten. They did not speak that first evening. Too many people, too much activity. But Grenna's eyes found Teslin across the yard, and in that look there was recognition. Understanding. A silent message that said, "I know why you are here, and I am with you." It was enough. That night, alone in her small room, Teslin laid out everything she had learned: the hollow logs, the torch oil, the passage vessel, the bone carving, Morvain's betrayal, Kael's patterns of movement. She had found the shape of the plan, but there was still something missing, something she could not quite see. The ember root would create smoke. The smoke would cause confusion and panic. But Kael was not relying on poison alone, that much was clear. The poison was meant to create chaos, to pull attention away from something else. The real kill would come differently. In the moment when everyone was focused on the smoke and the panic, when guards were rushing to evacuate the hall, and servants were screaming, and pack lords were trying to protect their own, in that moment of perfect chaos, Kael would move. But how, with what, toward whom? Teslin sat on her cot and thought about everything she knew about Kael, about the way he moved through space, about the patience he had shown in placing his traps, about the 3 generations of kills he had completed without ever being seen. And then she understood. He would not go for Valdrin alone. That would be too simple, too expected. If Valdrin died but his heir survived, the kingdom would mourn, but it would continue. Power would pass, stability would hold. But if both Valdrin and his heir died in the same moment in the same attack, then there would be no clear succession, no legitimate claim. The pack lords would turn on each other. Civil war would tear Lupara apart. Kael was not here to kill a king. He was here to destroy a kingdom. And the heir was Valdrin's young nephew, a boy of 14, brave and eager and completely unaware that his life was measured in days. Teslin pressed her hands over her face, felt the weight of it. The terrible mathematics of assassination. 2 targets, maximum chaos, minimum time. She needed to tell Valdrin, needed to warn him. But even as the thought formed, she knew she would not yet, because warning meant changing the plan, and changing the plan meant losing her only advantage. Instead, she would watch, she would position herself, and when the moment came when Kael made his move in the smoke, and the chaos and the perfect storm of distraction he had spent weeks creating, she would be ready. She had to be, because if she failed, Valdrin would die. His nephew would die. And the kingdom she had spent 5 days trying to save would tear itself to pieces. She lay back on the narrow cot and looked up at the dark ceiling of her small room. Outside, the fortress was settling into its night rhythms, guards changing shifts, servants banking fires, the slow quieting of a place that believed it was safe. But Teslin knew better. Safety was an illusion, and illusions were what Kael used as weapons. Somewhere in this fortress, he was making his final preparations, counting down to the feast, confident in his plan, certain of his success. He did not know that an Omega woman with no rank and no power had found every piece of his carefully constructed web, did not know that she had seen him, tracked him, read his patterns like words written in her mother's handwriting. He did not know she existed, and that was the last mistake he would ever make. On the sixth morning, Teslin found the message. It was carved into the stone wall outside her door, small, easy to miss. Just three symbols scratched into the mortar between two blocks. Omega symbols, ancient marks. The kind that had been used generations ago when Omegas were not allowed to read or write the common script. Secret language, hidden communication. Teslin knelt beside the wall and traced the symbols with her finger. Her heart was very calm, very steady. The message was simple. Clever, Omega. But cleverness dies at feast night. Kael knew. Not everything, but enough. He had noticed her watching, had seen the small disruptions in his perfect pattern, the way information had flowed incorrectly through Morvain, the presence of a servant who moved through spaces she should not have been in. He did not know her name, did not know the extent of what she had discovered, but he knew she was a threat, and he had sent this message to tell her that he was not afraid, that her cleverness would not save her, that when the feast began and the smoke rose and the chaos came, she would die along with everyone else who stood in his way. Teslin stood up, brushed the stone dust from her fingers, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for days. This was no longer a hunt where only one party knew it was happening. This was a duel, between her eyes and his invisibility, between her patterns and his chaos, between the Omega who had spent her whole life being dismissed and the assassin who had spent 3 generations being perfect. Only one of them would walk out of the feast hall alive, and Teslin had no intention of dying before her mother's death was finally truly avenged. The moon rose over Iron Peak. The feast was 2 days away, and in the growing darkness, 2 hunters circled each other, both invisible, both waiting, both absolutely certain they would win. The day before the feast, Teslin met with Valdrin one final time. It was early morning. The fortress was just beginning to wake. She found him in the small chamber where they had spoken before, standing at the window with the same cup of dark wine in his hand, as though he had not moved since their last conversation. As though he had been standing there for 6 days watching the sun rise and set, waiting for the moment that would determine whether his kingdom survived or fell to pieces. He turned when she entered. His amber eyes were tired, but sharp, always sharp. "Tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. "Tomorrow." He set the cup down, crossed his arms, the posture of a man bracing himself for bad news. "Tell me what you need." Teslin had spent the entire night thinking about this moment, about what she would ask for, what she would need to stop Kael when the time came. She had gone through 100 different plans, 100 different approaches, and in the end she had come back to the same answer. "Nothing," she said. Valdrin's eyes narrowed. "Nothing. Your guards cannot help me. If they position themselves differently, Kael will notice. If they watch me instead of watching the crowd, he will see the pattern shift. Everything must look exactly as it always looks. The feast must proceed as though we know nothing, as though we suspect nothing. And you will simply watch and wait, and hope that when the moment comes you are fast enough." "Yes." Valdrin studied her for a long moment, and then he shook his head slowly, not in refusal, in something that looked almost like wonder. "You are either the bravest person I have ever met," he said quietly, "or the most foolish. I am neither, your majesty. I am simply the only one who can see him." He picked up his wine cup, did not drink from it, just held it, turning it slowly in his hands. "Grenna spoke to me last night," he said. "She told me about your mother, about what happened when you were 15, about how no one believed you." Teslin felt something tighten in her chest. She had not wanted Valdrin to know that story, had not wanted him to see her as someone broken by the past. But Grenna was right to tell them. He needed to understand why this mattered, why she would risk everything to be believed this time. "She said you have been waiting 10 years for someone to listen to you," Valdrin continued, "that you have been carrying that weight alone, that gift of yours folded up and hidden away because the world told you it was worthless." He looked at her directly, and his voice dropped lower, gentler. "I am listening now, Teslin of Ashvale, and I believe you. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the outcome, I want you to know that. You were right, and I heard you." Teslin felt her throat close, felt the pressure behind her eyes that meant tears were close. But she did not let them fall, could not let them fall. Not now, not when she needed to be steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Valdrin nodded once. Then he straightened, became the king again. "All business. all command. My nephew will sit beside me at the feast. He does not know about any of this. I want him kept in ignorance. If he knows there is danger, he will try to fight. And a 14-year-old boy fighting Kyle is a dead boy. I understand. Grenna will be in the hall. She knows what to watch for. If something goes wrong, if you cannot reach me in time, she will have antidote ready. It will not save everyone, but it will save those closest to her. The antidote will not matter if KL succeeds, Teslin said quietly. The poison is not meant to kill. It is meant to create chaos. The real danger comes after. Valdrin's jaw tightened. Then see that the real danger does not reach us. I will. He looked at her for one more long moment, and then he did something that shocked her. He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. The grip was firm. The touch of an alpha to an omega should have felt like dominance, like weight, but this felt different. This felt like an equal acknowledging an equal. You will have a place in my council when this is over, he said. Not as a reward, but because you have earned it, because you see what we do not, and because I need that sight beside me. Teslin looked up at him, at the king who had summoned her from the edges of his territory because an old healer had whispered her name, at the man who had listened when no one else would. I will not fail you, she said. I know. He released her shoulder, turned back to the window, and Teslin left him there, looking out at the fortress that would either stand or fall based on what happened in the next 24 hours. The great feast began at sundown. Teslin had positioned herself in the hall an hour before the first guests arrived. She wore the same plain tunic she had worn for 6 days, carried the same water jug, looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, an Omega servant, invisible and unremarkable, part of the background noise of a celebration. She found her place near the side entrance that led to the kitchens, the spot where she could see the entire hall, where she could track movement and patterns in the subtle shifts that would tell her when Kale was preparing to move. The hall filled slowly, first the servants laying out the final preparations, the long tables arranged in a horseshoe shape with Valdrin's table at the head, the fire pits burning bright down the center, fed with the old wood from the front of the stack. Not yet the hollow logs, not yet the poison. Then came the guests, the 12-pack lords with their retinues, warriors in colored armor, advisors in formal robes, attendants carrying banners. The hall filled with voices and movement and the particular energy of wolves who had traveled far to be seen in a powerful place. Teslin watched them enter, watched where they sat, watched the patterns form. Grenna arrived with Lord Aldrich's group. She caught Teslin's eye across the hall, a brief moment of connection, a silent message that said, I am here. I am ready. Then Valdrin entered and the hall went quiet. He walked the length of the room with that same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. His nephew walked beside him, a boy trying hard to look like a man, shoulders back, chin up, scared and excited and completely unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been 3 generations in the making. They took their seats at the head table. The council members arranged themselves on either side. Teslin watched Morvain take his place, watched his eyes flicker once to the section of wall where the bone carving was hidden. A final confirmation, a signal sent and received. Everything is ready. Proceed. The feast began. For the first hour, nothing happened. Food was served. Dark bread and roasted meat and root vegetables glazed with honey. Wine flowed from clay pitchers. Conversations rose and fell in the warm air. Laughter, boasts, the competitive friendliness of pack lords establishing their status through stories and insults. Teslin moved through the space with her water jug, refilling cups, clearing plates, always moving, always watching. She had found Kyle within the first 10 minutes. He was positioned along the far wall in the section where the lower-ranked attendants gathered, the ones who had come as company for higher-ranked wolves but who had no official role in the ceremony of the evening. He wore the same plain servant's clothes he had worn all week, the same unremarkable face, the same relaxed posture of someone who belonged exactly where he was. But Teslin could see him now, could see the way his eyes moved in those slow, deliberate sections, could see the way he tracked not people but positions, angles, distances. He was not watching the feast, he was measuring it, calculating it, waiting for the moment when all the pieces he had placed would begin to move. The fire pits burned lower. The first load of wood had given its heat and gone to ash. Servants began their trips to the wood store, carrying back bundles on their shoulders, feeding the fires, keeping the hall warm and bright. Teslin counted the trips, kept perfect track. She knew exactly which load would reach the hollow logs, knew exactly when the poison would enter the hall. She watched Kyle watch the fire pits, saw him counting too, saw the subtle shift in his posture, the gathering, the tightening of something underneath the surface. The sixth trip to the wood store happened. The servant returned carrying a bundle that included the first hollow log. Teslin saw it clearly. The darker wood, the careful shaping, the thing that did not belong. The servant threw it into the nearest fire pit. The flames caught, the wood began to burn, and slowly and visibly, the ember root paste inside began to heat. It started with the smell, not strong, not obvious. Just a faint sweetness in the air that had no reason to be there, like flowers burning, like something beautiful being destroyed. Teslin had wrapped a cloth around her face, pretending to wipe sweat from her brow. But the cloth was soaked in the antidote paste that Grenna had given her earlier. Crushed herbs, bitter and sharp. It would not make her immune, but it would slow the effects, give her a few extra moments of clarity when everyone else began to lose theirs. Around the hall, people were beginning to notice that something was wrong. A pack lord coughed, shook his head as though trying to clear it. One of the warriors swayed slightly in his seat, put a hand to his temple. Confusion starting to ripple through the crowd. The smoke from the fire pits was thickening. Not dramatically, not in a way that would cause panic, but enough, just enough. Teslin watched Valdrin, saw him reach for the cup that Grenna had placed beside him earlier. The antidote wine. He drank it slowly, casually as though it were just part of the feast. His nephew was too young for wine. But Grenna was already moving through the crowd toward him. A healer checking on the guests. Natural. Expected. The hall was getting louder. Voices rising, people calling for water, for air. The first edge of panic beginning to show. And Kyle was moving. Not running, not rushing, just drifting. From his position along the wall toward the center of the hall, toward the head table, his hand was at his side, fingers slightly gathered. Ready. Teslin moved too, parallel to him, keeping the crowd between them, invisible in the growing chaos. She saw his target, not Valdrin, not yet. The nephew, the boy who was standing now confused, looking around at the adults who were coughing and swaying, vulnerable, exposed. Kyle was 10 paces away, 8, 6, and then something happened that Teslin had not anticipated. Another Omega servant stepped directly into Kael's path, a woman, older, maybe 40. Teslin did not know her name, but she had seen her working in the kitchens all week. Head servant, the one who directed the others, who knew every rhythm of the hall. The woman looked at Kyle, and her hand moved to the small knife she carried at her belt for cutting meat, and she stepped deliberately into his way. Not attacking, just blocking, just being an obstacle. Kael's eyes flickered to her, cold, pale, measuring. Move, he said quietly. The first word Teslin had ever heard him speak. His voice was soft, empty. The voice of someone for whom other people were just obstacles to be removed. The Omega woman did not move. You will not touch the boy, she said, and Teslin understood. This woman had been watching too, had seen Kyle moving through the hall all week, had not understood what he was, but had understood that he was wrong, that he did not belong. And now, in the moment when it mattered, she was choosing to stand in his way, even though it would cost her everything. Kael's hand moved, fast, professional. The blade appeared from somewhere in his clothing, short, sharp, designed for killing at close range. But before he could strike, Teslin was there. She did not have a weapon, had nothing but the water jug in her hands. But she swung it hard, catching Kyle's wrist at the exact moment his blade was rising. The jug shattered. Water and clay shards exploded across the space. The blade went spinning across the stone floor. Kael turned to her, and for the first time she saw recognition in his pale eyes. You, he said, me. The hall around them was chaos now, people shouting, guards rushing toward the head table, smoke still rising from the fire pits. But in the small space between Teslin and Kael, everything went very quiet, very still. Clever Omega, he said. You found my work. All of it. He smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, just a showing of teeth. Then you know you cannot stop me, even without the blade. There are other ways, other plans. I have been doing this longer than you have been alive. Teslin felt the coldness in her chest spreading, the same coldness she had felt when she first saw the yellow in her mother's eyes, the certainty of danger, the knowledge that death was close. But she had lived with that knowledge for 10 years, and it did not frighten her anymore. You are right, she said clearly, loudly, her voice cutting through the chaos. You have been invisible for 3 generations. Perfect, unstoppable, the shadow that no one could catch. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could have reached for her, could have ended her with his hands if he wanted. But I saw you, she said, From the first day, I tracked every piece of your plan. I know about the hollow logs, the torch oil, the passage vessel. I know about the bone carving in the wall, and I know about the man who hired you." She turned, raised her voice even louder, speaking now not to Kale but to the entire hall. "Counselor Morvain," she called, "the assassin is here, the one you hired to kill our king. He is standing right here." The hall went absolutely silent. 300 wolves, all of them turning, all of them looking at Teslin, at Cahill, at Morvain, who had gone white as snow. "The Omega lies," Morvain shouted, but his voice was wrong, too high, too desperate. Teslin kept her eyes on him, kept her voice steady. "Then explain the bone carving in the wall behind the king's seat," she said. "Ancient assassin code, a signal that only two people in this hall would know. The assassin who placed it, and the man who hired him." She reached into her tunic and pulled out the small piece of carved bone she had removed from the wall that morning, held it up so everyone could see. "This mark means ready, waiting, proceed as planned." Gasps rippled through the hall. The pack lords were standing now. Guards were moving, closing in. Morvain tried to run, made it 3 steps before 2 warriors tackled him to the ground. His careful smile was gone. His composed face had collapsed into something ugly and afraid. Kael did not run. He simply stood there looking at Teslin with those cold, pale eyes. "You made me visible," he said quietly. "No one has ever done that before." "I know." "How am?" Teslin met his gaze, and for the first time in her life she did not look to the side, did not hide what she was, what she had always been. "Because I have been invisible my whole life," she said, "and I know how it works. I know where invisible people stand. I know how they move. I know the patterns they make when they are trying not to be seen. You were perfect, but you were invisible to people who live in the light, not to someone who has spent 25 years living in shadow." Something moved in Kael's face. Not respect exactly, but acknowledgement. The recognition of one hunter by another. "Worthy," he said, the same word he had carved outside her door. But this time it sounded different. This time it sounded like truth. He did not resist when the guards took him, did not fight, just allowed himself to be bound and led away, as though the game had been played and lost and there was nothing left to do but accept the outcome. The aftermath came quickly, efficiently. Grenna moved through the hall with her assistants administering antidote to those who had breathed too much of the ember root smoke. Most recovered quickly. Some needed to be carried to the healing rooms, but no one died. The poison had not been strong enough to kill, only to confuse, only to create the chaos that Kael had needed. The guards found everything Teslin had described. The hollow logs, the torch oil, the passage vessel, all of it exactly where she had said it would be. Morvain confessed before they even began questioning him. Broke completely, sobbed that he had wanted power, that he had believed he could control the kingdom better than Valdrin, that hiring Kael had seemed like the perfect solution. Clean, untraceable. He had not counted on an Omega Mender from Ashvale seeing what his own council could not see. The Omega woman who had stepped into Kael's path was brought before Valdrin. Her name was Bretta. She had worked in the kitchens of Iron Peak for 15 years. Head servant, respected by the others. She had blocked Kael because she had seen him watching the boy, had seen the predator's focus in his eyes, and she had decided in that moment that some things were worth dying for. Valdrin gave her a purse of gold and a formal commendation. But more importantly, he gave her a seat at the Servants' Council that governed the daily operations of the fortress, made her voice equal to the voices of ranked wolves. Small change, but change nonetheless. The next morning, Valdrin called a full assembly. All 12 pack lords, all their retinues, the entire council, every ranked wolf in Iron Peak. They gathered in the great hall which had been cleaned and aired and made ready again as though the chaos of the night before had been a dream. Valdrin stood before them. Teslin stood beside him. Not behind, not to the side, beside. He told them everything. How an Omega woman had been summoned because she saw what others missed. How she had found an assassin that his guards and advisors had not found. How she had tracked every piece of a plan that had been 3 generations in perfection. How she had stood in front of Kael and made him visible when he had spent his entire life being shadow. The hall was absolutely quiet. "Teslin of Ashvale saved my life," Valdrin said. His voice was clear, formal, the voice of a king making a pronouncement that would be recorded in the histories. "She saved my nephew. She saved this feast. And she saved Lupara from the civil war that would have followed if Kael had succeeded." He turned to look at her. "She did this alone, without rank, without power, without any of the things that we are taught matter. She did it with nothing but her eyes and her mind and her refusal to be silent when she saw danger. He paused. Let the weight of those words settle. There is an empty seat on my council, Morvaine's seat. I offer it to Teslin of Ashvale, not as a gift, not as a reward, but because she has proven that she sees what we do not, and because I need that sight beside me. The pack lords murmured among themselves, some approving, some uncertain. An Omega on the king's council was not something that had ever happened before. Not in Iron Peak, not anywhere. But Teslin did not accept immediately. She looked out at the assembled wolves, at the ranked and the powerful and the ones who had spent their whole lives believing that rank was what gave you voice. And then she spoke, clearly, loudly. I will take the seat, she said, with one condition. Mus Valdrin raised an eyebrow. Name it. I do not want to be the only Omega voice in power. I do not want to be an exception that proves nothing except that one Omega was useful once. I want law. I want every pack in Lupera to have Omega representatives in their councils. Not as servants, not as tokens, but as equals. The murmuring grew louder. Shock, outrage from some, excitement from others. Teslin kept her voice steady. I am not exceptional, she said. I am simply the first Omega in a long time who was given the chance to prove what we can do when we are listened to. There are others like me, in every pack, in every territory, people who see what you miss, who read patterns you ignore, who know things you have never thought to ask. She looked directly at the pack lords. You have spent generations dismissing us, ignoring us, believing that rank determines worth, and it has made you vulnerable, made you blind. Morvaine sat on this council for 9 years. 9 years of trust and respect and honor, and he betrayed all of it. While Bretta, an Omega kitchen servant, saw the danger and stepped between an assassin and a child without hesitation. She paused. Let that sink in. If you want strong packs, you need all voices, not just the loud ones, not just the ranked ones, all of them, especially the ones you have taught yourselves not to hear. The hall was very quiet. Valdrin looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned to face the pack lords. She is right, he said simply. We have been fools, comfortable fools, and our comfort nearly cost us everything. He raised his voice. I decree that every pack council in Lupara will include Omega representatives, chosen by the Omegas themselves, given equal voice in decisions that affect their packs. This is not optional. This is law, and it begins today. The hall erupted, arguments, protests, but also cheers. Grenna was standing in the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered face. Bretta was nodding slowly as though something she had waited her whole life to hear had finally been spoken aloud. And Teslin stood beside the king of Lupara, an Omega woman who had spent 10 years being silent and felt the weight of every dismissed voice in the kingdom settling onto her shoulders. It was heavy, but she was strong enough to carry it because she had been carrying it alone for so long, and now finally she would not have to carry it alone anymore. 6 months passed. Teslin sat at the council table in the chamber where decisions were made. Morvaine's old seat, but it did not feel like his anymore. It felt like hers. Earned, deserved. She had solved 3 more conspiracies in those 6 months. Small things, not as dramatic as KL, but dangerous nonetheless. A merchant cheating the grain supplies. A guard taking bribes to look away from smugglers. A minor lord planning to poison a rival's water supply. She saw them all. Read them all. Stop them all. And slowly, grudgingly, the other council members had begun to listen to her, to ask her opinion, to value the sight she brought to their deliberations. Change came slowly. Some packs embraced the new law, brought Omegas into their councils with genuine openness. Others resisted, appointed Omega representatives but gave them no real power. But the law existed, and it could not be taken back. Grenna had taken the position of Omega Elder Advisor. She sat in meetings with the healers and the scholars, contributed knowledge that had been dismissed for 60 years, made sure that Omega voices were heard not just in governance, but in every aspect of Fortress life. Bretta ran the Servants' Council with quiet efficiency, and when younger Omegas came to her with concerns or fears, she listened, and she passed those concerns up to Teslin, and Teslin brought them to Valdrin. The system was not perfect, but it was better, and better was a start. On a cool morning in early spring, a young Omega woman arrived at the gates of Iron Peak. She was perhaps 17 years old, thin and nervous. She carried a letter of introduction from a pack elder in the Southern Territories. The letter said that she had a gift, that she saw patterns others missed, that she had predicted a drought 3 months before it happened, and her pack had survived because they had listened to her warning. The guards brought her to Teslin. They met in the same small chamber, where Teslin had first spoken privately with Valdrin. The girl sat in the chair across from her, hands folded, eyes down, the posture of someone who had spent her whole life making herself small. "What is your name?" Teslin asked gently. "Rena, counselor." "Look at me, Rena." The girl looked up. Her eyes were dark, watchful, afraid. "You see things," Teslin said. "Patterns, changes, things that are coming before they arrive." Rena nodded slowly. "And people do not believe you." "They listen now," Rena said quietly. "After the drought. But before that, they said I was inventing things, making trouble, that Omegas should not speak about matters they do not understand." Teslin felt the old familiar ache, the echo of her 15-year-old self trying to warn people about her mother, being dismissed, being ignored. "They will say that," Teslin told her, "many times. For the rest of your life, there will be people who dismiss you because you are Omega, because you are young, because you are not ranked or powerful or what they expect wisdom to look like." She leaned forward. "But you will speak anyway. Do you know why?" Rena shook her head. "Because while they are looking at you and deciding you do not matter, you will be looking at them and seeing the truth. You will see the lies they believe, the dangers they ignore, the patterns they miss because they are too comfortable in their certainty. And when the moment comes when the thing you saw arrives and they finally understand you were right, they will have no choice but to listen." She reached across the table and took Rena's hands in hers. "You are not alone," she said. "Not anymore. There are Omega voices in every pack now. Small voices, yes, new voices, but they are there, and they are growing stronger. And you are part of that, part of something that is changing the shape of this kingdom." Rena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What should I do?" she whispered. "Watch," Teslin said. "Read, see, and when you see danger, speak, even when they do not want to hear it, especially when they do not want to hear it. Because being right is not enough. Being heard is what saves lives." She released Rena's hands. "I will help you. Grenna will help you. Every Omega who has fought to be heard will help you. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. We are building something here, something that will outlast all of us." Rena nodded, wiped her eyes. And when she looked at Teslin again, there was something new in her face. Not just fear, not just hope, but determination. The set of someone who had been given a purpose and intended to fulfill it. Teslin walked her to the door, watched her leave, and felt the weight on her shoulders grow just slightly lighter, because she was not carrying it alone anymore. That evening, Teslin stood at the window of her chamber, not the small room near the grain stores. She had been given proper quarters now, a real room with a real bed and windows that looked out over the eastern hills. The sun was setting, the sky had turned the color of old gold, the same color it had been the day she first arrived at Iron Peak. 7 days before the feast. 7 days before everything changed, she thought about her mother, about the yellow in her eyes that no one would acknowledge, about the death that could have been prevented if just one person had been willing to listen to an Omega girl who saw what others missed. She thought about Kael, about the shadow that had been invisible for 3 generations, about how he had been caught, not by warriors or guards or ranked wolves, but by someone who lived in shadows too, someone who knew how to read them. She thought about Mervain, about how rank and respect in years of service had not made him wise, had not made him trustworthy, had only made him arrogant enough to believe he would never be caught. And she thought about Bretta, about Grenna, about Rena, about all the Omega voices that were rising now across Lapara. Quiet voices, dismissed voices, but voices that were finally being heard. The door opened behind her. She turned. Valdrin stood in the doorway. He looked tired. He always looked tired these days. The weight of ruling a kingdom that was changing faster than anyone had expected was heavy. But his eyes were kind. "The Northern Pack Lords are complaining again," he said. "They say the Omega representatives are slowing down their council meetings, making everything more complicated." Teslin smiled slightly. "Good." Valdrin raised an eyebrow. "Things should be complicated," she said. "Easy decisions are usually wrong decisions. If the Omega representatives are asking questions that make the Lords uncomfortable, then they are doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing." Valdrin shook his head, but his mouth curved slightly at the corner. "You have ruined me," he said. "I used to make decisions quickly. Surely, now I question everything. Wonder what I am missing, what pattern I am not seeing. That is wisdom, Your Majesty, not ruin." He stepped into the room, stood beside her at the window. They looked out at the hills together, at the kingdom that was slowly learning to see with new eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Taking this seat, this weight, you could have gone back to Ashvale, Gone back to your quiet life, your mending work. Teslin was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it took 10 years, she said finally, that my mother had to die before I learned that being right is not enough, that being heard is what matters, that silence is not safety, it is just another form of death. She turned to look at him. But I do not regret this, any of this, because every Omega girl who comes to this fortress now will see my seat at your council table, will know that their voices can matter, that being dismissed is not the same as being worthless. And maybe that will save them the 10 years I lost. Maybe that will save them the grief of being right and ignored. Valdrin nodded slowly, and they stood together in the fading light, an Alpha King and an Omega Counselor, watching the sun set over a kingdom that was learning slowly and painfully to see in the dark. The moon rose over Iron Peak. The feast fires burned in the Great Hall. Not with poison now, just with ordinary wood, safe, warm. Decisions were made in council chambers, Omega voices woven into every deliberation. Bretta directed her kitchen staff, and when they saw problems, they spoke, and they were heard. In villages across Lipara, young Omegas like Rena learned to watch, to read, to see, and they learned that their seeing mattered. And in her chamber, Teslin of Asheville sat at her desk and wrote a letter to Grenna, updating her on Rena's progress, discussing plans for a formal training program for Omega representatives, building the structure that would outlast them both. The kingdom had not been saved by warriors or walls or the strength of armies. It had been saved by an Omega woman who refused to be silent, who saw what others missed, who understood that those who live in shadows see the light more clearly than those who have never known darkness. And the kingdom would never forget it. Generations later, they would still tell this story, the story of Teslin the Sighted, the Omega who caught the uncatchable, who changed the laws, who opened the doors that had been closed for centuries. They would tell it to Omega children who were learning to be brave. They would tell it to ranked wolves who were learning to listen. They would tell it to anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or told that their voice did not matter. And the story would always end the same way. With these words, those who are unseen see the most, and when they finally speak, kingdoms change.